Okay, good evening, good afternoon, whenever you happen to be listening to this. For this podcast, we're going to be covering points from Book 4, going very quickly over some of the issues that we've already addressed in the first four chapters of Book 4. Keep in mind that Aristotle begins Book 4 in the first chapter by considering different ways of thinking about political theory or different ways of seeing the way it's applied. It can be applied in regards to very specific regimes, what I've called applied theorizing. What is appropriate, what is going to be acceptable or good in this one particular regime. There is generic theorizing, what is best for most regimes in general, what can most regimes aspire to. There is what I call ideal theorizing, theorizing about the best regime, is the best possible form of political community that you can imagine. And there's also what I've called conditional theorizing, which would be theorizing in accordance with a presupposition or a partial perspective on politics, say democratic theorizing or oligarchical theorizing. For most of Book 4, I would argue that Aristotle is concerned with what we call generic theorizing, insofar as he's talking about what is necessary or what is possible, perhaps, in the attempt to achieve one of the good forms of the regime, a polity. The second chapter of Book 4 describes this new orientation. Right? Here he's talking about, in this book, not about what is best simply, but what the best regime in general would be, particularly concerned here with what is most attainable for most types of political communities. Now, it turns out, as he goes through this analysis through Book 4, that the divisions between regimes are not going to be as absolute as they might at first appear. So, as we'll see, moderate forms of oligarchy and democracy are very similar in a lot of ways. As it turns out, even good regimes are very close to defective regimes, so he's departing from the initial classification scheme that he introduced in Book 3 to some degree. It's not that he's departing from it, but he's clarifying it. Part of the reason that even good regimes are close to defective regimes is that the best regime possible for most political communities is some version of a polity, which Aristotle will now suggest is a combination or mix of democratic and oligarchic elements. Chapter 3, very briefly, discusses the economic basis of regimes. He begins by talking about how the precise character of oligarchies and democracies will depend very much upon the very particular way in which those regimes essentially develop their wealth, or the kinds of individuals that compose the society. He contrasts this with the perception of regimes, which he argues that typically most people are going to conceive the essence of political conflict as being between oligarchy and democracy. And perhaps there'll be less attention to the particular circumstances which decisively shape the nature of those regimes. One way to think about this, in my mind, is that what Aristotle is pointing to in this book is the simple fact that, to a considerable degree, a lot of politics, a great deal of political life, a great deal of political conflict will be conflicts based upon the divisions between the wealthy few and the not so wealthy many. And politics and political leaders that have to concern themselves with defusing this potential conflict. And perhaps one way they can do this is to see that it's not simply the case that the conflict between the wealthy and the poor is going to be the same everywhere. It's going to vary depending upon the kinds of individuals that make up that society. Right? Okay, chapter 4. Here we had the comparison of regimes to animals, which is a strange, but I think Aristotle is saying it's a natural comparison. One thing he wants a political theorist to do is to overcome the tendency to think of politics in terms of radical opposition. So he might say that, well, people tend to think of regime types, say democracies and oligarchies, as different species of animals, right? But the entire argument of Book 4 is that, for better or worse, regimes are a continuum. They're not discrete species, so the elements of different regimes can be mixed together in order to overcome their opposition. The other problem is that regimes are like animals, where the spirit of the animal or the body of the animal has taken over the intellectual functions. This is the significance of that long discussion we had in class about the place of deliberation within the regime, and the sense or the discussion there of the republic, where there's this tendency in most regimes for, say, the military component of the regime to take over the ruling function. Now, we might say that this is not the only possibility. You know, the only, it's not as if the only alternative to being ruled by a genuinely virtuous elite is a military rule. But we can think of this as just stating the general problem. Getting a regime actually governed by those who, in a sense, deserve to rule on the basis of virtue is going to be incredibly difficult. And here, at various points in Book 4, Aristotle is going to be reminding his aristocratic audience of the very simple fact that the virtuous few are few. They're few in number. It's not only a matter of justice that requires them to try to conciliate opposing viewpoints. It's a simple fact that in actual practice, it's going to be very, very difficult for the virtuous to ever simply assume power. So the functions of political virtue are constantly being supplanted by approximations of virtue. He almost goes as far to say that you only get approximations of virtue in practice, and a military virtue is one approximation of that. It's not that it's not virtuous in some sense, but it's not quite the same thing as genuine political wisdom or political prudence. Now, as we go through Book 4, we'll see that there are several different types of polity which Aristotle is presenting as, this is really what you can aim for in practice. So insofar as, I think what he's going to try to show is that genuine aristocracy is impossible, but you can have these different versions of a good regime. One version of polity is one he will call a so-called aristocracy, and this is a polity that leans towards oligarchy, so it's an oligarchically inflected form of polity. What happens here is that instead of a genuinely virtuous regime, a genuine aristocracy rather, you will have kind of approximations of aristocracy. So he refers to the leaders, the ruling class as it were, or even just the leading class of this regime, as a regime based upon noble birth and wealth in some capacity. So this is, as we'll see, what's key to a so-called aristocracy is that it's an oligarchy in which the ruling elites see themselves as an aristocracy, and ideally, the non-elites also see the leaders as not merely oligarchs but aristocrats as well. This, as it turns out, is going to be a pretty unstable version of polity, an unstable version of a mixed regime. Aristotle is also going to suggest another version of a polity, what he'll call a middling regime. And in this case, it's a stable society, or more stable society, created without the need or without the presence of a virtuous ruling class, but is instead stabilized by the simple fact that there is a class in between the contending forces of oligarchy and democracy. And while Aristotle says that this is a possible regime, this doesn't require any element of utopian speculation or any entirely unrealistic circumstances to exist, nevertheless it's going to be extraordinarily difficult in practice to create this version of polity. We'll also see that he discusses, albeit very briefly, what we might call a military regime, a regime in which the ruling many are defined by their military virtue, and this is actually the virtue that he associated with polity back in Book 3 as well. So we'll talk a little bit more about all these as well. Okay, if you're following along on the slides which I posted last week, now take a look at slide 13. What Aristotle is talking about in Book 4, in the latter half of Chapter 4 rather, He's basically raising the question of, okay, if you have these defective regimes, democracies and oligarchies, uh, what exactly can you aim for? Right? What can be achieved in these defective regimes, or stated somewhat differently, are there better or worse versions of these kinds of regimes? And in fact, there are. Democracy and oligarchy, they seem to be classified on the basis of two main factors. On the one hand, there's the scope of participation in the regime, which for both oligarchy and democracy is determined by the scope of property qualifications, right? So democracies in general, you're going to have low or no property qualifications for participation in politics. In oligarchy, you're going to have, in some cases, very significant property qualifications, but this seems to be like a continuum, right? So, as we'll see, the least bad forms of democracy and oligarchy will coincide on this question of the scope of participation as determined by property qualifications. Just as important, probably even more important, is the presence or absence of the rule of law, which in this presentation here appears to be categorical. So, for instance, Aristotle is basically, as he's presenting it here, he doesn't get into the fact that in actual practice, the rule of law can take on, it's not always going to be perfectly implemented or not implemented at all. There can be a lot of intermediate stages. For the purposes of his presentation here, the rule of law is something that either exists or it doesn't. Okay, so we can see on the one hand that the least bad democracies are characterized by the fact that there's a kind of balance between the well-off and the poor. He says that freedom and equality exist insofar as all participate in the regime. So here we see that the least bad form of democracy, equality does not trump freedom, and perhaps one way to think about this is that in the least bad form of democracy, there's something in it for people who are not fully committed to the democratic regime. The democratic regime becomes worse, or the worst forms of democratic regime become worse by virtue of being more democratic, in the sense that there is a much broader range of participation based on smaller property assessments or no property assessments at all. But the worst form of democracy is democratic rule without law. He says decrees rather than laws or the nomos are authoritative. And here we might recall that for Aristotle, the rule of law, the kinds of laws that he's talking about, seem to encompass almost everything from what we call statutes to what we call norms or customs. Right? So in other words, the less bad forms of democracy are going to be constrained in a lot of ways, not only by the fact that there's a greater degree of balance between oligarchs in the regime and the people, but also by the fact that the less bad forms of democracy are going to be constrained by norms independent of the will of the citizens themselves. Now, similar to his analysis of democracy, Aristotle will say that the least bad forms of oligarchy are those which are least oligarchic. So in the first form that he refers to, the offices of the regime or participation in the regime are filled on the basis of assessments, property assessments here. So the poor are not going to share, even though they're in a majority, say, but at least potentially the offices are open to participation. Right? You might say that it's an oligarchic meritocracy. The regime becomes worse as the assessments are increased up to the point where the oligarchies become essentially dynastic. Right? He describes oligarchies where fathers, or rather sons, succeed their fathers in office. So here you can imagine that oligarchy becomes worse as it becomes more like a wealth-based caste system. And finally, the worst form of oligarchy is similar to the worst form of democracy in the sense that it is rule without law. It's a counterpart to tyranny, and even a counterpart to the tyranny of the majority. So this is important to keep in mind. Again, the least bad forms of democracy and oligarchy end up resembling one another in a sense, particularly in the sense that the least bad forms of democracy and oligarchy are those that are governed by the rule of law, and in the sense that political participation in both forms of democracy and oligarchy, the least bad forms, is relatively open. Or another way to think about this is that citizenship is connected to property in this analysis. And this notion of having a property requirement for citizenship is probably particularly odious for us. It's here where you think, well, we're too democratic for this. We don't think there should be any property requirement for participation in citizenship. We should at least ponder why, if for Aristotle, this is at least a possibility. We might say that, well, the fact that you possess any specific amount of wealth is simply arbitrary, and this has no relation to one's capacity as a citizen. Well, Aristotle would probably agree to that to some extent, but he would at the same time suggest that, well, maybe there really is some way in which the possession of wealth is connected to the capacity for citizenship. It's not virtue per se, but it is perhaps an unavoidable substitute. There's something, in other words, even though it's a defective claim, there's something to the oligarchic claim that the capacity for citizenship requires a certain degree of independence that property in some amount would provide. Now, we tend to think that this is unacceptable because we might first say that, well, no, people simply deserve citizenship based upon the fact that they are people. But of course, we have standards of our own, standards that are also arbitrary in a sense, particularly age. Our restrictions of even our modern liberal democratic forms of citizenship are rooted in age, and that's arbitrary in a real sense. Like, how do we know that there aren't any number of 15-year-olds who are very much more capable of exercising the capacities of citizenship than someone who's 50 or 60 or 40 or whatnot? Nevertheless, we accept this more or less arbitrary standard because it contains an element of truth. In general, though this is not categorically true, you're going to require a certain degree of maturity to be a citizen, and even if there's some doubt about 15-year-olds, there's less doubt about 12-year-olds. By the time you're down to 6 or 7-year-olds, everyone knows they're not quite ready to participate. The point here is that in political practice, there are going to be substitutes for genuine virtue or capacity, and we make use of these substitutes, in the case of age, that are not necessarily that much less arbitrary than the kinds of property qualifications that Aristotle was talking about. Another way of thinking about this. Aristotle is clearly saying, or at least hinting in some sense, that property may be connected to political moderation, in the simple sense that propertied citizens in a democracy are less likely to promote extreme forms of democracy. Another way of thinking about this is that if you want to moderate a democracy, if you want to prevent the worst forms of democracy, you would be sure to try to promote property ownership amongst as many citizens as possible. This would allow the virtues of property ownership to develop, as modest as they might be. Okay. The other thing to see is the role of the rule of law in separating the worst forms of democracy and oligarchy and the less bad forms. The rule of law essentially prevents oligarchies and democracies from bottoming out into tyrannies. Now, if we think about this discussion of the rule of law in Book 3, this might be somewhat surprising because there it seemed as if Aristotle was mounting a pretty serious critique of the rule of law. The rule of law looked definitely, at least in the last chapters of Book 3, it certainly looks inferior to the rule of wisdom. And we can think back to the ways in which he articulates what you might call the ideology of legalism, which is all more or less erroneous, right? The legalists, those who think that the rule of law, however you conceive of it, is superior to the rule of the one virtuous individual, they have to argue things that are simply incorrect. The notion that you can have the rule of law without any need for discretion, that there are never situations that arise in which it's necessary to hold the law in abeyance. Going further, the notion of the rule of law depends upon the notion that there are guardians of the law who are best able, or better able than a single individual, to reconcile the particular needs of a situation with the universal standards of law. Well, it's difficult to know if that's going to be true. And in fact, Aristotle would say that in many instances, the claims of the one wise individual is going to be superior. Going further, and this is an argument that we're probably familiar with from contemporary politics, is the notion that the rule of law is superior to the rule of individuals, for the simple reason that the rule of law is somehow stands above political influence or political emotions. But this is suspect for any number of reasons, right? The laws in any given regime are going to be regime dependent, right? And more importantly, the application of the law, particularly in the instances he's talking about here, which is about the question of, well, how can you apply the law in circumstances where it doesn't seem as if this particular situation was anticipated? How do you apply the law in emergency situations? Here, it doesn't seem as if there's any way to get around the fact that, well, one individual, one virtuous individual, one wise political leader might be better at making those kinds of determinations than a collection of law guardians, right? Than a group entrusted to oversee the law. Finally, and perhaps most suspiciously, Aristotle articulates back in Book 3, as you might recall, this claim of the legalists that law itself is or can be rooted in reason alone, if not divine intelligence. So the defenders of the rule of law ultimately think of law as being sort of a brooding omnipresence in the sky, something which will determine everything, something that could resolve everything. And Aristotle simply suggests that in practice what this means is it's either completely confused, or it simply ignores the fact that law is going to be dependent on a regime or dependent on a regime's particular traditions. In practice, however, the rule of law is going to separate relatively decent democracies and oligarchies from the most tyrannical forms of them, right? So even though theoretically it might be better to have the one best ruler who can decide in any particular instance what is required, in theory it might be better to have the one individual who is capable of seeing both the need for general principles and the need to adjust them to particular circumstances. In actual practice, in defective regimes, it's almost always going to be better to have the rule of law. For the simple reason that in defective regimes, it's not going to be the one wise individual or the one wise king who's making the decision. It's going to be the leaders of those defective regimes, zealous oligarchs, zealous democrats. So the rule of law becomes very attractive as a principle once you enter into the world of practical politics. And this is despite the fact that it is nevertheless true that the laws will be regime dependent, and to that extent they could be defective. This raises a question, though. What exactly do you get from the rule of law in a defective regime, right? How great is it to have the rule of law in an oligarchy or a democracy when those rules, when those principles, however you understand them, whether it's the customs or the statutes or the constitutional law or the conception of rights, if those are ultimately dependent on the people who are actually ruling? One quote from a French novelist kind of summarizes this problem. And this is the French 19th century French novelist Anatole France. Quotes, "The law in its majestic equality forbids the rich as well as the poor to sleep under bridges, to beg in the streets, and to steal bread." So that's raising the claim that you don't really get a lot from the rule of law, right? Oligarchs are going to not gain that much protection by the rule of law in a democratic regime, and similarly for the Democrats or the poor in an oligarchic regime. Now, Aristotle would say, I think, that this is true, but only to some extent. So the question we have to ask is exactly why is the rule of law a good thing even in a defective regime? The basic answer is that anyone is going to be better off in a regime that rules based on general laws as opposed to specific decrees. In other words, it's better to be ruled by law, whether understood as custom or just general promulgated rules, as opposed to having power applied on a case-by-case basis. And we understand that this is a good thing. We could understand that even if you view our society as an oligarchic society, which it is from some perspective, it's hard to think how that's, the absence of, say, criminal laws or the absence of a judicial system would somehow make things better, right? Now, clearly, the fact that power is applied through a legal system makes it less oppressive. Though, of course, the point is that it's not perfect. We understand that it's better to control crime through the criminal law as opposed to having crime controlled through Batman, right? Though truth be told, the fantasy of Batman actually illustrates the advantages of being ruled by the one most virtuous person as opposed to the rule of law. When you're being mugged, the rule of law won't help you, but Batman might. Getting back to the main point, we understand, I think, that it's good for political power to be constrained by law, particularly when it's being used against us, right? Even if this means that criminals sometimes go unpunished. The rule of law is, of course, imperfect. It's unequal. And Aristotle wouldn't deny that the rule of law is going to, within an oligarchic regime, let's say, it's going to provide more benefits for the oligarchs as opposed to the poor, right? But this doesn't mean that the poor will be better off if the oligarchs simply rule on the basis of decree, if they just make things up as they go along, if they simply remove all legal or moral constraints on power. Another way of thinking about this is that the rule of law is often the best thing about bad regimes. And you can also think about this in terms of law as what we might call moral norms. It's hard to think of any regime that will be better off if it simply abandons moral norms. And that's what we often understand by tyranny, a regime that simply doesn't have any sense of conventional moral norms. Think of the example of Nazi occupying governments in various places where if, let's use the example not of France, because the French resistance is always over-exaggerated. Let's use the example of a village in Serbia where some Serbian insurgent has blown up a Nazi rail line or something. Well, in many instances, the Nazis would, instead of sort of going through a legal process trying to figure out who did it, instead of conducting a legal investigation, the Nazis would just line up people from the town and say, give up whoever did this, or we're going to start shooting people, and then they would start shooting people. Right? That's an example of a regime where they basically say, we no longer need law. We no longer need norms. We no longer need to be concerned with desert. With a society which will govern based on collective punishment or anything else that serves the regime. Right? So that's a pretty specific example of how, well, yes, almost any regime would be better, particularly for those who are perhaps not included in the regime. Any regime is going to be better if it governs on the basis of law. It provides at least some restraint on imperfect regimes. This is what Aristotle says about lawless democracies. He says that one may hold it a reasonable criticism to argue that a democracy of this sort, that is, a lawless democracy, is not a regime. For where the laws do not rule, there is no regime. And that is at least confusing, but I think what he's talking about here is that a democracy or an oligarchy that rules without law simply doesn't extend anything common to all of the individuals in the society as a whole. There's nothing held in common by the people, right? Law would provide at least some common thing, some common standard, however unfair or unequal it might be. Okay, several other points about the varieties of democracy and oligarchy. Again, it's interesting that Aristotle associates freedom with the least bad form of democracy. It's almost an echo of Socrates' analysis of democracy in the Republic. So you can think of this, that the least bad form of democracy provides a kind of benefit that's going to be attractive to those who are not necessarily partisans of the regime itself. Though even Aristotle, of course Aristotle and Plato would argue that freedom is at least an ambiguous good. Finally, we should keep in mind this claim that the worst forms of democracy and the worst forms of oligarchy turn into tyrannies, which is another way of saying that the worst forms of democracy, those that have abandoned the rule of law, are no longer governed by the best citizens. In the absence of the rule of law, democratic cities are going to be governed not even by democratic citizens themselves. Aristotle suggests that in those kinds of regimes, democracies will in fact be governed by popular leaders or demagogues. He compares the popular leaders in democracies to the flatterers of tyrants, right? And the point appears to be that, in the absence of the rule of law, democracies are not even really democracies because the rule of the people will be supplanted by the rule of popular leaders. So here's another connection, I think, between Socrates' analysis of democracy and Aristotle's, that in the most extreme forms of democracy, in which the will of the people is not restrained by anything, you're not really going to be governed by the will of the people at any point. You're going to be governed by popular leaders who are well on their way to being a kind of tyrants. Note as well the way in which Aristotle describes the worst form of democracy. For the people become a monarch, from many combining into one. And this seems to bring up at least two former themes. We can think back to Book 3, Chapter 11, where Aristotle discussed the notion of democratic virtue, where he argued that the people as a whole possess more virtue than the few. And here Aristotle is raising the implied question that came up even back then, whether or not it's always the virtues of the people that predominate when they're made into one. So the idea here is that the people become a kind of monarch ruling without law in extreme forms of democracies, but they're made into one by popular leaders who are now governing as kinds of tyrants. And that's really the second point. The notion of the people becoming a monarch in the absence of the rule of law makes us think of the debate between the rule of law and the rule of wise kings from the end of Book 3. So you might say that in the most extreme form of democracy, the people think erroneously that their collective virtue will allow them to rule without law. And of course, you could easily imagine kings making the same mistake. So, in the worst form of democracy, the people appear to rule but do not. Popular leaders supplant the ruling rule of the people, just as the flatterers of tyrants are often the real power behind the throne in monarchies. Quote, they become great through the people's, that is, the demagogues, they become great through the people's having authority in all matters, and through having authority themselves over the opinion of the people, since the multitude is persuaded by them. And this would apply, I think, to oligarchy as well, which he also says in its worst form becomes like a tyranny. So again, in oligarchy, the dynamics is of course different because what happens is that you get to tyranny in a different way. Presumably, it's because as oligarchies take on worse and worse forms, the scope of the ruling elite becomes narrower and narrower. It becomes more like a caste. The scope of participation becomes restricted further and further until you have essentially a regime which no longer attempts to govern based on law, but governs simply in the name of unconstrained oligarchy. Okay, so what can you do if you're dealing with these imperfect regimes? How can you gain, or how could you prevent oligarchies and democracies from descending into their lawless and tyrannical forms? And this seems to be the main issue in Chapter 6 of Book 4. There's a basic principle for the reform of these defective regimes here. And the principles are as follows. You have to moderate political participation. And you have to moderate political unity. And this is at least a little bit strange, because in a sense what Aristotle is saying is that in defective regimes, to make them less bad, you often have to moderate or constrain the expression of people's political nature. Bad regimes become less bad by being less political. And I think this is easy enough to see. Defective regimes, pursue the partial truths, whether it's of democracy or oligarchy, with the passion of zealots. So in a way, you have to find ways to restrain that passion within the bad regimes. Now, how exactly do you do this? Within democracy, Aristotle argues that, well, you have to arrange essentially the economic basis of the democracy in such a way that the attractions of politics will be reduced. So he says that in a way, the least bad form of democracy will be one in which most citizens are engaged in farming and have a moderate amount of property. Why is farming so important? Well, the idea here is that the demands of managing the property that they have, essentially the demands of managing the household, or it will limit the scope of democratic activism in these kinds of regimes. So going further, the regimes become worse insofar as there's more leisure for the populace to engage in political life. The worst form of democracies occur as the cities become large, everyone participates in politics, the multitude come to have authority, and they're all provided the opportunities to participate. And then the multitude come to have authority over the regime in the absence of law. Right? So even if citizenship must be accommodated in some circumstances, within defective regimes, right, the solution for defective regime is not to allow the main supporters of that regime to have even more power. That's not going to improve the regime. In the long run, according to Aristotle's argument, that's not even going to make it more democratic, insofar as the expanded scope of participation in the absence of law is both going to create conflict within the regime, and insofar as it's going to start transforming the regime not into a democracy, but into rule by essentially a tyrant. The same dynamic is going to occur within oligarchy. The best form of oligarchy ends up being almost indistinguishable from the agricultural form of democracy that Aristotle has discussed. Here, again, based on the same principle, the most moderate form of oligarchy is a society where there's large numbers of people with some amount of property. And again, here, law, understood as general rules but also custom, comes to have authority in this kind of regime precisely because the oligarchs are not so wealthy that they have an immense amount of time to scheme amongst themselves. Right? The scope of participation is limited precisely because wealth is widely distributed, but it's not so concentrated that there's going to be a class of oligarchs who become fully engaged oligarchical citizens. So, the basic problem, then, strangely in defective regimes, is the problem of leisure. In defective regimes, people must be kept busy, whether you're talking about oligarchy or democracy. They have to be kept busy, they have to become focused on private affairs, precisely because their political passions, should they have the opportunity to express them, are going to make the regime worse. And I think Aristotle also talks about, obviously doesn't solve the problem, but talks about the problem of friendship amongst the oligarchs. The problem is that, and you can easily imagine this, as an oligarchy becomes more and more caste-like, there's more of a class consciousness amongst the oligarchs themselves. Perhaps it's easier and easier to hand off privilege from one generation to another. That becomes a problem, right? The oligarchy becomes worse as it becomes more of a unified political community. The basic norm here, of course, is to simply limit the participation of zealots. The defective regimes are going to be better off if they're governed by a set of stable norms and rules, as opposed to being characterized by active or engaged citizens, whether of the oligarchic or democratic stripe. What else can you aim at? Is there anything else that you can attempt to achieve with deviant regimes, or can you only hope that you'll have something like the rule of law, more or less disengaged citizens, because if they are engaged, they're going to be passionate zealots who are going to start moving the regime in the direction of tyranny? Yes, as it turns out. You can aim for more than this. Though even here, the legislator politicians will have to temper their expectations. Okay, so now we can turn to slide 14, and we're going to consider how Aristotle will argue that polities can be created through the principle of mixing together the elements of democracy and oligarchy. So, turning now to chapter 7. Aristotle has distinguished the different types of democracies and oligarchy. He's articulated the basic norms that must guide deviant regimes. In general, for deviant regimes, active citizenship is not going to be a good thing. Political participation and political enthusiasm have to be minimized. But now we can turn to some alternatives. He appears as if he's going to move to a discussion of two distinct regimes, aristocracy and polity. But we'll see that in practical terms, the first regime who he's going to discuss now, which we'll refer to eventually as a so-called aristocracy, is really almost indistinguishable from polity. And both of them have much in common with democracies and oligarchies. They're essentially constituted out of the elements of democracy and oligarchy. So this is what he says in chapter 7 about these kinds of regimes, that is, so-called aristocracies. Quote, he says, there are certain regimes which differ both from those that are oligarchically run and from so-called polity and are called aristocracies. For wherever they elect to offices, not only on the basis of wealth, but also on the basis of desert, the regime itself is different from both of these and is called aristocratic. For indeed, in cities that do not make virtue a common concern, there are still certain persons who are of good reputation and held to be respectable. So what he's talking about here is what he'll refer to, and what I'll refer to, as a so-called aristocracy. And in this aristocracy, you might think of it as aristocracy in practice. It's not going to be based upon the rule of the virtuous or the capable in any simple sense. Again, it's going to be based on a kind of substitute for virtue. At various points in these chapters, he's going to refer to either reputation or noble birth. So in actual practice, the aristocracy he's talking about here, they're a kind of oligarchy in which the ruling elite are reputed to be virtuous. And thus, so-called aristocracy is a kind of polity, a polity that inclines towards oligarchy, but presumably is going to transcend the simple imbalances of oligarchy. It's not going to be the worst form of oligarchy. It's going to be better than even the least bad forms of oligarchy. But how this so-called aristocracy will be a better version of oligarchy is at least a little bit unclear. So, turning to chapter 8, Aristotle suggests that all polities are based on a mixture of oligarchy and democracy. And again, we can think back to the classification of regimes back in Book 3, where a polity is essentially described as the rule of all, or the many in the interest of all. And now Aristotle is going to point out that just as there can be different versions of democracy and oligarchy, there can be different versions of polity. He says that if the mixture of oligarchy and democracy leans towards democracy, it can be called a polity. In the end, though, even that regime will be similar to the so-called aristocracy, and eventually Aristotle will almost equate them. The key thing to see here, as I see it, is that Aristotle is saying that in actual political practice, there is unlikely to be much recognition of genuine political virtue. It's as if he's saying the best kind of aristocracy you can get in practice is a polity that inclines towards aristocracy in some sense. But this is what this so-called aristocracy requires. It seems as if he's saying that in a so-called aristocracy, the oligarchs have to be misrecognized as aristocrats. What exactly does that mean? Well, essentially, a so-called aristocracy has a ruling elite in which the people understand the elite, as aristocrats, even though they are not aristocrats. What does this mean? Well, we can see this if we turn to section 1293 of B35. And the key feature here, when he's describing polities that incline towards aristocracy, or it's rather polities that incline towards oligarchy, their key feature is that the people are going to recognize the elites as if they are genuine aristocrats. In other words, there'll be a sense in these kinds of polities that even though there is an elite, and even though there's an element of oligarchy in the elite, it's not based upon wealth alone. You can see this in this section because Aristotle is constantly referring to what is held to be true about the ruling elite in so-called aristocracies. So he states that the well-off possess what the multitude holds good, and thus they are held to be the noble and good gentlemen. He says that aristocracies attempt to establish the power of the best, and it's asserted that this happens as well in oligarchies. So again, in polities, there is a tendency to assume that the possession of wealth is going to coincide in some way with the virtue of genuine aristocrats. Going further, he says, it is held to be impossible for a city to be well managed unless the best manage the regime. So what he's saying here is that, a polity is, it's like an oligarchy in which everyone has accepted that the oligarchs are entitled to rule. But, and I think this would be crucial, for this to be good, for this to be genuine rule in the interest of all, the oligarchs themselves would have to conceive themselves as aristocrats ruling in the interest of all. Aristotle is quick to point out that this isn't always going to happen. In most cities arranged in this manner, in most so-called aristocracies, the so-called aristocrats will aim at the advantage of the well-off. But at the same time, it's possible, at least, that they can aim at the interests of the poor, and particularly the freedom of the poor. So in here, he's pointing out that the so-called aristocracy can overlap to a certain extent with the least bad forms of democracy. So, how are we to think about this so-called aristocracy as a kind of polity? What's happening, and what he's really describing, is that virtue is now being defined in terms of birth and family. So you see throughout these sections he's constantly referring to not simply the virtue of aristocrats, but an aristocracy that's determined by birth or a noble family. And essentially what he's saying that this maybe is the best you're going to get in this kind of polity. Actually existing aristocracies perhaps are all going to be so-called aristocracies, rooted not simply in ability, but rooted in the existence of essentially long-standing families who create and raise a privileged elite. But what makes it good, in some sense, what makes it better than the worst form of oligarchy, is that this elite is actually respected by the people it rules, and again, the elite understands itself as having certain responsibilities for leadership. It's going to be very difficult for us to understand how this regime could be good, except if we were to contrast it with an extreme oligarchy, where the oligarchs understand themselves as ruling only in their own interests and simply, screw everybody else. Right? The purpose of this society is simply to create wealth, to reinforce the wealth of the wealthy. Aristotle is saying, well, you can have a different version of this kind of society in which those elites, even though their power is mostly rooted in wealth, or at least to some extent rooted in wealth, it's still possible to have an elite that will see itself as having responsibilities to the society as a whole. The picture I've used to illustrate this is from the television show Jeeves and Wooster, which is based upon short stories by the writer P.J. Wodehouse. What you're looking at is a picture of Bertie Wooster in the front holding the martini glass, who represents the aristocrat, and Jeeves is his butler. And the point of all these stories is that Wooster is an upper-class twit, and he's always getting into hijinks, but he's basically directed by his Aristotelian butler, you might say, who's philosophically educated and basically just has common sense. Yeah, it's going to be difficult for us to see a society like, say, pre-World War II Britain, one with which is truly a so-called aristocracy in terms of what Aristotle is talking about, where there's just a sense there is a class of individuals who are born into an elite, they expect to be a member of that elite, but Aristotle is saying that, well, it's possible for them to understand their responsibilities not only in terms of their own class, but in terms of the society as a whole. Perhaps that's not aiming for much. Perhaps that model seems repugnant. But Aristotle's point is that you cannot necessarily aim for very much in political life. Whether or not this exists as a real possibility is something that's worth thinking about, but we can definitely see the elements of so-called aristocracy, even in the liberal democracy we live in today, in a very attenuated form. Think about it in terms of Liberal Party leader Justin Trudeau, right? Is it good for Canadians to be enamored with Justin Trudeau simply because that he's born from a sort of noble family, the closest thing we have to a Canadian political aristocracy? Well, Aristotle's answer is that there's a kind of rationality to this. There's a kind of rationality in assuming that a Trudeau is going to have an attachment to Canada, perhaps an attachment to the political community, and maybe even a kind of political experience that maybe not any given individual or any given member of the upper crust is going to possess. So it's not entirely irrational to think of this as a kind of general principle that could structure a society. That is, you'd have an elite that is easily recognized as an elite simply because of essentially their family connections. And there would be the hope and expectation on the part of both the public and the elite themselves that they have a kind of responsibility or duty to the society as a whole. You could contrast, say, maybe people think, well, this is just the stupidest possible reason to think that someone's going to be a good leader, the fact that he comes from a politically notable family. Though I should point out, it happens all the time. It happens not only in Canada, it also happens in the United States. Maybe I shouldn't have brought up the American example. But we can contrast this perhaps with former Liberal Party leader, Michael Ignatieff. You might say that, well, he represents a kind of a natural aristocrat, right? In the sense that he, has demonstrated his own intellectual capacity. And even if you don't accept that about Ignatieff, just sort of run with the example for a bit. Well, it shows that, what happened with Ignatieff is that, people questioned his attachment to the political community. And it turns out that maybe that questioning was reasonable in at least some sense. The thing to see is that for this decent regime, Aristotle is not setting his sights very high. It's almost as if he's pointing out that in practice, almost any actual aristocracy is going to look like this. It's going to look like a society where positions of power are not determined based simply upon actual capacity. It's going to be determined based upon what we would call privilege. And Aristotle says that that is not necessarily the worst type of regime. If it's not the best, if it's certainly not the best imaginable, it's easy enough to imagine worse versions of this. Now, I've included another example in the slide, another image, to help you think about what Aristotle might be talking about here, one that's probably more familiar to you than the stories of Jeeves and Wooster. And of course, it's Frodo and Sam from The Lord of the Rings. Now, in the movie version of The Lord of the Rings, it's the aristocratic elements of Hobbit society doesn't come out nearly as clearly as it does in the book. But in the book itself, it's quite clear that Frodo and his cousins, right, what are they called, Pippin and Merry, they represent the kind of propertied elite of Hobbiton. And Sam represents basically, the working class who not exactly oppressed, but they also recognize that in some sense it's almost natural for these upper class hobbits to rule. And because of that expectation, the argument would be that, well, the hobbits themselves, exercise their power judiciously, and they see that they have a kind of responsibility for the community. Now, if you say that both the versions are just ridiculous and this does not work out that way in practice, we'll note that Aristotle will see, will accept that line of criticism. He's going to mention at various points that this version of polity, this attempt to mix together the principles of oligarchy and democracy, is going to be very unstable. Right? So this is not certainly not an ideal solution, precisely because this version of polity will always have the tendency to transform itself into oligarchy simply. We can see some aspects of the problem as we turn to chapter 9, where Aristotle starts discussing how polities come into being. And again, we should note here that Aristotle seems to be talking about the creation of a regime. So he's thinking of this in terms of a kind of political project. The basic idea is that you can combine elements from the legislation of democracy and oligarchy to, in a sense, balance out these different components. So essentially, what this leads to is that the regime itself will seem democratic or oligarchic, depending upon your perspective. It will seem to be both at the same time, both and neither. And in essence, that becomes part of the problem. Because Aristotle says that you've created a good mixture of democratic and oligarchic elements. You have this sort of the property assessments established in just the right way. You have just the right amount of deference to elites, but not too much excessive ambition or insolence on the parts of elites. You've got it balanced out perfectly, when none of the parts of the regime would wish to have another regime, and then the polity becomes preserved through itself. If we think about it for a second, that's going to be a very unstable political situation. So the question we'd have in talking about this first version of polity, so-called aristocracy, we would say that, well, given the intense moral zealotry that can so often accompany different perspectives on regimes, how can we be certain that the tensions between Democrats and oligarchs within polity won't lead to one group being ultimately dissatisfied with the regime in some way? It's perhaps for this reason that Aristotle turns to the very short discussion of tyranny in chapter 10, perhaps raising the specter then of that in actual polities there's going to be always this tendency to slip back down the slope towards the worst forms of oligarchy, or perhaps the worst forms of democracy. Aristotle doesn't focus too much on tyranny in this book, I think for the simple reason that he's talking about what's possible in political practice, and he doesn't want to emphasize the fact that, well, yes, in political practice, it's not so very difficult to create a tyranny. He doesn't want to focus on that as a political option. What he wants to focus on is what are the good types of regimes that are possible. And it seems as if this contrasting so-called aristocracy with tyranny, it leaves you wanting more, right? We can see how the balance based upon an elite, which is not really an aristocracy, but seen as an aristocracy, we can think of all kinds of reasons why this version of aristocracy is not necessarily going to be long-lasting. Though we can also think of some places, some societies where it was relatively long-lasting. The usual objection would be is that, well, in actual practice, these so-called aristocracies are really just oligarchies. In chapter 11, Aristotle wants to consider another version of polity. He asks, what kind of regime can you aim for without assuming any special conditions? What kind of regime is possible in most times and places? This is what I referred to earlier as generic theorizing. You can think of it as the stairmaster of political theory, right? Insofar as at the beginning of book 4, he's comparing political theory to physical training. What he's searching for here is a standard of political life that's kind of a general standard of health that most regimes could aim at without assuming any special or unusual conditions. Aristotle says that aristocracy is outside the range of most cities, perhaps even the so-called aristocracy. That's kind of a dispiriting observation on the point of Aristotle, because that so-called aristocracy he's been talking about, that didn't even seem that fantastic, right? It's not only genuine aristocracy that's difficult to achieve, practically impossible, but creating that balance of a so-called aristocracy where you don't really have the best people ruling, but they're still sort of responsible, even that's difficult to achieve for the reason I've just mentioned. It's going to be very difficult to balance out the forces of oligarchy and democracy. The so-called aristocracy will always, and particularly, be transforming itself into simply an aristocracy. It seems as if Aristotle's setting us up for another deflating, lower your expectations type of argument. But something else occurs instead here in chapter 11. This is what he says, quote, "If it was correctly said that the happy life is one in accordance with virtue and unimpeded, and that virtue is a mean, then the middling sort of life is best, the mean that is capable of being attained by each sort of individual. These same defining principles must also define virtue and vice in the case of a city and a regime, for the regime is the way of life of a city." Now, what is he talking about here? Well, Aristotle is talking about his discussion of virtue from the book, The Nicomachean Ethics. And the idea, one of the main ideas of the ethics, is that the virtue or excellence, the characteristics that we aim at, can be understood as a mean between two extremes. This is a mean not understood as an average. There's nothing average about excellence. You can think of it as a kind of mark or target that lies between two extremes. So the mean between fearfulness and foolhardiness is something like the verge of courage. So courage is a peak in a way. It's not average, but it is in between these two excesses. Now, how this translates to the political level it's somewhat unusual the way Aristotle is describing it, but what he seems to be saying is that what we'll call a middling regime, or even a middle class regime, is not only the best in the sense of being the generic best, the kind of regime that most actual political communities could aim at. It's almost as if he's saying that this is best in terms of actualizing the virtue of most people. I would go further and say this regime might be simply the best if we judge it by the interests of philosophy, but more on that later. In what way would a middling or middle class regime be the best? So this is basically what he's saying here. He's suggesting that one form of polity involves balancing out oligarchs and democrats, and it requires a bit of what the Marxists would call ideology, in the sense of that the democrats have to believe the oligarchs are actual aristocrats. This is another way to get at polity, and it's about creating a class that is neither rich or poor, the middle class. And in a way, this regime will be like a kind of facsimile of philosophy. Aristotle says that such a regime is readiest to obey reason. He says that the conventionally well-off and the poor, aren't as well equipped to obey reason. Okay, so why would we think that both the well-off and the poor are less likely to obey reason? Well, what Aristotle says is that the wealthy are essentially more likely to have a certain kind of arrogance, and he says the poor are petty and base. Now, of course, we're offended by the notion that one is made worse as a person by being poor, though we're perhaps more likely to accept the notion that being born wealthy can make you spoiled and arrogant. Aristotle, of course, can't prove these, what you might call sociological observations. I think there's certainly room to disagree, but nevertheless, this is his claim. Aristotle also suggests that the middle class has an advantage because it doesn't want to avoid ruling, but it doesn't desire to rule either. Now, what exactly does this mean? They have a kind of ambiguous relationship to politics. And in that sense, the middle class is a kind of counterpart to the philosophical perspective on political ruling. Aristotle says that the preeminent, the wealthy, do not know how to be ruled. They're always going to be chafing against it. They're always going to be resisting any attempt to constrain them. And he observes that the needy can only be ruled in the manner of a master. They have perhaps his argument is that they're less likely to be self-controlled. If you're wondering about the objectivity of this evaluation of the relative virtues of the middle class and the poor or the wealthy, you might want to think of this as Aristotle perhaps painting an optimistic picture of how he thinks the middle class should conceive itself. He says that oligarchs and democrats, when they live together, are not really living in the same political community. Envy and contempt is going to consume them, right? So in contrast, the middle class regime is going to be more of a community. There's simply going to be less division. Strangely, Aristotle says that the city wants equality of this kind, the kind embodied in the middle class, to exist. And it's rather a strange phrase. It's somewhat similar to treating nature as a god, as we saw back in Book 1. It's hard to see in what sense the city as a city would want to have this kind of regime. Nevertheless, it makes a certain amount of sense, or at least his claim that the city will be best able to preserve itself if it's constituted by a middle class regime seems to make much more sense, just in the sense that the kind of hatred or fear that would exist even in a so-called aristocracy, or certainly in an oligarchy, is not going to exist in the same degree in a regime that's constituted by a middle class. So, going further, Aristotle suggests that the middling element is particularly superior or particularly desirable as the basis of a regime, because tyranny is something that tends to emerge out of regimes that are either based on the people or regimes that are rooted in an oligarchy. So the claim here is that tyrants are simply not going to be as likely to emerge. And again, the simple idea here is that, well, it's precisely the conflict between oligarchy and democracy that pushes both oligarchies and democracies in the direction of tyranny, first away from the rule of law, then finally to the rule of one individual who's essentially monopolizing political power. Here's another claim that we might well wonder about. One wonders, that is, if it's actually the case that tyrannical regimes can't emerge out of middle-class regimes. We can think of 20th century examples. To what extent did the Nazi regime emerge out of a middle-class regime? I guess you could raise, in Aristotle's defense, you could say that the Nazi regime did not really emerge out of a middle-class regime. It emerged out of a middle-class regime that had become poor, where essentially the basis of the middle class had been destroyed. So you might raise an objection that a middle-class regime in which its members lose access to property, lose access to any kind of even moderate stability, is going to suffer the same fate of democracies, or at least be tempted by the same kinds of politics that leads to tyranny in some democracies. Going further, Aristotle says that middle-class regimes are not beset by faction, and this will be particularly true in large-scale societies. That, again, seems to be untrue, at least in our situation. Once you get to a large-scale nation-state, the claim that a middle-class regime will be free from faction seems to at least be somewhat suspect. We might say that factions can form around things besides class, right? So if you have a large-scale society, even if you have a fairly broad-based middle class, you can still have factions based upon different understandings of community, different types of affection amongst individuals, and so on. We would even see, say in Canadian society, even, insofar as Canada is a middle class society, there could be economic interests that will break different regions apart. Nevertheless, I think we could accept Aristotle's claim that democracies, polities rather, without something like a middle class are going to be inherently unstable. And that's what I think the main significance of the argument here, why he's introducing this version of polity as a superior alternative to polities that either incline simply towards oligarchy or polities that incline towards democracy. You need this particular kind of mixture, not simply a balancing of different classes, but in fact a class that combines elements of democracy and oligarchy within itself. But Aristotle is also quick to point out that most regimes end up pushing in the direction of either democracy or aristocracy. The middling element is simply too few in number in many cases, and the tendency towards oligarchy or democracy will take over. Here Aristotle is essentially saying that in many kinds of societies, and possibly in polities as well, certainly in polities, the factions that are balanced out are going to grasp for preeminence. They will not even be concerned with establishing a regime that's common or equal. As he states it here, he says they grasp for preeminence in the regime as the prize of victory. And so he says the middling regime has never arisen. Never arisen, that's pretty strong terms for Aristotle, and essentially he's imagining a middle-class regime as a future possibility. And he describes it as the best regime. We might say, or qualify that by saying that it's the best regime in general. The best must be understood not only in terms of what is possible in theory, but also understood in terms of what is best in practice. As we turn to chapter 12, Aristotle is essentially, he's going to be trying to rallying support for the middling class regime, or at least rallying support for the decent mixtures of oligarchy and democracy that could take the form of so-called aristocracy or polity. What he seems to be saying is that political leaders or legislators must fight the natural tendency for regimes to deviate towards oligarchy or democracy. What this means in practice is that the legislator has to strengthen the middling elements and avoiding what Aristotle in this chapter calls the natural course. So this is another an ambiguous reference to nature, right? Nature does not, as we know, it pushes us into political life, but when it pushes us into political life, it seems to create this natural division between the many and the few, and it's necessary for the political actors to counteract that tendency if you want to avoid the worst kinds of regimes. How do you do this, right? How can you avoid the natural course? Well, he states again the basic principle that the part that wants the city to continue has to be superior to the part not wanting this. And now we can see that this is going to be more difficult in a simple mixed polity, a simply mixed regime. The polity is going to be riven with internal dissension, right? You only have a balance of oligarchic and democratic forces. And again, it gets back to the fact that, keep in mind Aristotle's previous discussion of the perception of polity. The polity can be perceived as either a democracy or an oligarchy. And perhaps the problem is that, oligarchs are going to see the polity as being too democratic. Democrats are going to see it as being too oligarchic. And then factional strife is going to emerge as a consequence. And we can certainly see that reflected in our contemporary politics in a lot of different ways. In some instances, there will not be much that the legislator can do. And again, Aristotle refers to natural standards. Nature will set certain limits on political life, because he's basically saying that it's natural in some instances for a society to be a democracy. The multitude will simply be too strong, they'll be too preeminent. Perhaps in some instances, oligarchy is natural, not in the sense of good, but just in the sense of there's no way to get to a more mixed regime, or no way to immediately create a middling regime. The legislator can't be guided simply by what is natural in the sense of what's predominant, however. Aristotle suggests that the legislator always has to be thinking about ways to add to that middling class. The student the student of Aristotle, the prospective political leader, should try to interrupt what appears to be the natural course of the political world. He says that if he enacts oligarchic laws, he ought to aim at the middling sort. If democratic ones, he ought to attach these to them. Essentially, Aristotle is saying that really you have to have this middling sort predominate if you're going to have a polity emerge that is genuinely stable. The middle becomes, even if it doesn't dominate numerically, it becomes a kind of arbitrator between these different extremes. And in this sense as well, the middle class ends up being kind of a political or practical version of philosophy, right? Perhaps they will not see it in quite the same way. Perhaps they will not quite see the full problem of political life. But Aristotle is essentially suggesting that you can create a class of more or less ordinary citizens who are going to see that oligarchy and democracy only contain partial truths and try to moderate the contending claims of the many and the few. But Aristotle is quick to point out that the typical error for those trying to set up polities or so-called aristocracies is that they err by aiding the well-off. So perhaps he's emphasizing here the oligarchic deviations are the most tempting or the most likely. So, the previous discussions of polity and aristocracy have to be reevaluated in light of his discussion of the middling regime. Simply because Aristotle has pointed out that the mix of oligarchy and democracy that will constitute many polities is going to be inherently unstable in the absence of an actual class that will, in a sense, literally balance out the two different regime principles. Again, the main problem seems to be the tendency for polities, so-called aristocracies, to deviate towards oligarchy. And this is why Aristotle in chapter 13 turns to the question of devices used in polities against the people, which is at least an unusual thing to observe because we think of polities as, well, these are regimes that aim at the common good. But what we see now is that the problem is that these regimes aim at the common good only in the sense that the different forms of political deviance are just balanced out against each other. Right? There's always going to be this tendency for polities to break apart into oligarchic or democratic faction. So Aristotle goes through a list of various things that have to be avoided if you're going to maintain your polity. You can't have rules that only support the participation of the wealthy, right? You can't have a situation where only the wealthy are fined for not participating. You can't try to structure political participation such that the oligarchs are going to take over. You can't have a situation where political offices or juries or courts can be monopolized by the wealthy. Going further, Aristotle suggests that you can't excuse the poor from military training, and similarly with exercise. And this seems like a ridiculous thing to bring up, and, well, perhaps not ridiculous, but at least a very dated thing to bring up. Why is this so important? It's like, oh, the poor people, they're not going to have access to YMCA memberships or something like that. Well, what Aristotle is simply pointing to is the fact that there is a connection between self-government and the capacity to exercise force. Certainly for him, if not for us. We're used to a situation in the modern state where all forms of government are understood to be restrained by representation, not by direct participation. The state we're represented in the state, but the state also assumes a monopoly on violence. And this actually has an important effect upon the rule of law. What does this mean? Well, if you think about medieval or early modern forms of government, perhaps not all forms, I'm thinking primarily of government in England, it's interesting that the fact that the people were, in some sense, still capable of exercising military force against the government. You know, you go back far enough into the early modern period or the medieval periods, you know, kings can cause harm to certain individuals, there can be conflict, but it's very, very difficult for the king to simply dominate the populace. The populace might be dominated in other ways. You might talk about ideological dominance, but military force essentially lies in the people. The historian Thomas Macaulay put it this way. He said that in the Middle Ages or the early modern period, every person in England was in some ways a soldier, but no one was only a soldier. There's no military caste. There's not even really a standing army. So how does this relate to politics? Well, according to Macaulay, this capacity to exercise force meant that the people really always had a way to constrain government. If the king passed a law or ruled in an unlawful way, the people had the capacity to execute the king, and it would happen on occasion. This is ultimately the basis of the right to revolution and the right to bear arms in the American constitutional tradition. And so you can see the reason I'm only mentioning this is trying to explain how, why Aristotle's drawing this connection between, free forms of government in which the people are included in the form of government, and the capacity to exercise force. It seems strange to us today, but this is echoed in something like the Second Amendment, which was, at least initially, not mostly about having a machine gun in your home to protect yourself against burglars. The Second Amendment was included in the American Constitution precisely because it was thought, well, the people have a right to revolution if government is unlawful, and they can't really exercise that right unless they have, the ability to exercise force. And so Aristotle says here, essentially, that the attempt to make the people harmless is an oligarchic device. Obviously, we're going to disagree with this in a lot of different ways, but we should at least see the reason behind it. Now, Aristotle talks about some other devices that democracies use to essentially push their regime in the direction of democracy. It's more or less self-explanatory. Again, his point here is simply to say, to the political leaders, that you have to pay attention to these kinds of rules or laws that emerge in polities, essentially because there's always going to be this tendency in mixed regimes, in decent polities, for the regime to be pushed in the direction of one of its component deviant parts. And then something interesting happens here. There's a shift to a discussion of what I can only call the warrior polity, a polity that's constituted, not by a middle class, a polity that's not simply constituted by a balance between oligarchs and democrats that's called the so-called aristocracy. Now he says a polity can also take the form of a regime where the citizens are basically the heavy infantry or the hoplites. This is a little bit strange. In the previous paragraph, Aristotle argued that polities should be arranged so as to include the poor. In the Greek situation, for the Greek city-states, a polity of heavy armed infantry, it would not include the poor as usually understood. So now, in regards to this polity, in the very next paragraph, Aristotle was saying, well, this can happen, that the poor can be essentially tranquilized even if they are excluded from politics entirely, provided they're not treated arrogantly and provided they're not deprived of property. It seems to be a third alternative. Right? It seems to be a third form of polity. And the reason I mention it, and the reason I draw attention to it, is that it seems to raise the question of a perspective that has not been fully vetted yet in the politics. The question of whether or not the concerns of foreign policy, and thus the concerns of war, should predominate over the concerns of domestic polity. So, Aristotle concludes Book 4 with chapters 14 through 16 by discussing the various parts of the regime in what we might call a constitutional sense, or perhaps an institutional sense. He's talking about the parts of political life involving deliberating about politics, enforcing law, or in some cases, simply ruling. And in addition to this, he's talking about what we might call the judicial function of government, adjudicating different disputes. I'm not going to talk about this section in detail. I just want to point out a few important things. We might equate these three different functions, deliberation, enforcement or command, and adjudication, with our own separation of powers in the sense of a legislative branch, executive branch, and a judicial branch. This is not quite correct, because for Aristotle, political power is made safe not simply by separating functions, but rather by incorporating different types of individuals into the structure of deliberation, law enforcement, and adjudication. It's not clear how our own form of representative government would fit in with Aristotle's notion of these different aspects of political power. Let me just say a few things about them. He begins with what he calls the deliberative functions of government, the part that deliberates over common matters. Here he talks about the part of government which makes essentially momentous decisions, decisions about war and peace, decisions about new laws or alliances, even decisions about extremely important legal cases, and finally choosing and auditing of officials. So these things can be decided in a variety of different ways, and of course, the way in which the deliberative bodies are constituted will affect the character of the regime. And his basic point is that whether you're talking about oligarchy or democracy, you can push regimes, even deficient regimes, in a better direction by structuring the deliberative institutions. And the essential principle is that if you have a democratic society, you should structure the deliberative institutions in such a way that the excluded are included in some sense. In the case of oligarchy, for instance, he argues that you could have something like a situation where you have something like a representative body of the people, or simply a body of the people, which is presented with decisions that have been made by an oligarchic council. And so essentially what you would have is something like a democratic veto. He has various types of therapeutic advice for extreme democracies or extreme oligarchies. In every case, the principle is always, if you're an extreme democracy, if you want your regime to be better, you have to find ways to integrate your opponents into the regime. Whether you're talking about oligarchies or democracies, the whole point is to reduce the tension between the separate regimes, right? Reduce the tension, rather, between those who are included in the regime and those who seem to be and are, in many cases, excluded. Okay, so we've covered many of the main points through Book 4, in particular the notion that for Aristotle, the main principles of practical politics seems to involve establishing and strengthening the rule of law, which in many cases will require you not merely to talk about the rule of law, but to create a kind of society in which the rule of law is more likely to be respected. And in practice, this often means reducing the scope of passionate citizenship. Right? For Aristotle, the problem with political life, at least in deviant regimes, is that people care too much. But what they care about are merely partial principles. And if they act upon that care, if they act upon that zealotry, the regime is going to become worse. The regime is going to fall apart. The regime, at least, is going to be beset by faction. The actual political possibilities presented by Aristotle are admittedly not too thrilling, though they have the advantage of at least being possible. Presumably, we're all going to be more attracted to the middling regime as opposed to the so-called aristocracy, and I think that's true even for Aristotle. He points out that the so-called aristocracy as a form of polity is going to be inherently unstable. It's going to be most likely to turn into a conflict between oligarchs and democrats. Nevertheless, it is still preferable to the deviant regimes, and the problem, from his perspective, is that the middling regime, the middle class regime, is something that has never existed. So in making practical recommendations, Aristotle is not merely relying on what's out there. He's not making merely empirical observations about what's shown to be possible already. He's suggesting a possibility that hasn't yet been tried.